Don't skip. Your soulmate just found out they were wrong about you. And they're falling apart. Don't skip. Listen carefully. Author's note: this is a fictional, inspirational story. It does not claim that a real soulmate is secretly thinking about you or that these events are actually happening. Its purpose is to encourage empathy, honest communication, forgiveness, and personal growth. And listen to this. It began on what appeared to be an ordinary morning. The first rays of sunlight slowly filtered through the curtains. A cool breeze drifted through the open window. Birds welcomed the day with cheerful songs. People hurried to work. Coffee shops slowly filled with quiet conversations. Children laughed as they walked toward school. Everything seemed completely normal. Nothing hinted that this ordinary day would quietly become one of the most meaningful days of their life. Because your heart needs this right now, because life's greatest lessons often arrive during the most ordinary moments. Your soulmate woke with an unusual feeling they couldn't explain. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't sadness. It was simply a quiet sense that something inside them needed attention. For weeks they had been carrying unanswered questions. Questions they had never spoken aloud. Questions they believed had already been answered. Yet somehow, those answers no longer felt certain. And listen to this. They prepared a simple breakfast and sat beside the window with a warm cup of coffee. Usually they would immediately check messages, scroll through news, or rush into the day's responsibilities. This morning was different. Instead, they simply watched the world outside. A mail carrier greeted neighbors with a smile. A young father helped his daughter adjust her backpack before school. An elderly woman carefully watered flowers growing along her porch. Each quiet scene reminded them that people often carry far more kindness than we notice. Because your heart needs this right now, because slowing down helps us see what hurried assumptions often hide. Your soulmate smiled softly. Then one unexpected memory quietly returned. Months earlier, they had misunderstood a conversation. Someone had spoken briefly. Your soulmate had filled in the missing pieces with their own assumptions. At the time, it seemed reasonable. Now they weren't so sure. The more they reflected, the more they realized they had often believed they understood situations without asking enough questions. That realization unsettled them. Not because they believed they were a bad person, but because they genuinely wanted to understand others better. Because your heart needs this right now, because humility begins when we admit we may not know the whole story. And listen to this. Later that morning, they met an older mentor for coffee. The conversation began casually. They talked about work, family, dreams, future plans. Eventually the mentor asked a simple question. Have you ever been completely certain about something, only to discover later that you misunderstood it? Your soulmate laughed quietly. More times than I'd like to admit. The mentor nodded. Then said something they would never forget. Assumptions are comfortable because they feel complete. Understanding takes patience because it requires listening. Those words echoed quietly inside their heart. Because your heart needs this right now, because real understanding begins when we replace certainty with curiosity. Leaving the cafe, they couldn't stop thinking. Every conversation from recent months suddenly looked different. Every memory seemed to invite another perspective. Instead of asking, "Why did they do that?" they began asking, "What might I have missed?" That single question changed everything. And listen to this. Rather than heading straight home, they decided to walk through a nearby park. The breeze gently moved through tall oak trees. Children laughed while chasing bubbles across the grass. An elderly couple quietly shared lunch on a wooden bench. Nearby, two friends patiently worked through a disagreement. Neither raised their voice. Neither walked away. They simply listened. Watching them reminded your soulmate that healthy communication rarely begins with proving someone wrong. It begins with understanding one another. Because your heart needs this right now, because listening often heals misunderstandings long before solutions appear. Your soulmate quietly reflected. As they continued walking, they noticed a young boy trying to build a small wooden model airplane with his grandfather. Each time a piece didn't fit, the boy became frustrated. The grandfather smiled gently. "Slow down," he said. "Sometimes we think something is broken when we simply haven't looked closely enough." Those simple words reached far beyond the little airplane. Your soulmate suddenly realized they had approached several relationships exactly the same way. They had sometimes believed trust was broken when, in reality, understanding had simply been incomplete. That realization filled them with humility. Because your heart needs this right now, because patience often reveals possibilities that rushed conclusions never allow us to see. And listen to this. They found a familiar bench beneath a large oak tree and opened the notebook they had recently begun carrying everywhere. For several moments the page remained blank. Finally they wrote, "Today I realized I don't always know the whole story. Sometimes I respond to what I imagine instead of what was actually said. Sometimes silence isn't rejection. Sometimes distance isn't lack of care. Sometimes people carry burdens I never see." Reading those words brought unexpected peace. Not because every misunderstanding had disappeared, but because they finally recognized the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom doesn't pretend to know everything. It remains willing to learn. Because your heart needs this right now, because growth begins the moment we become teachable. The afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. Golden sunlight stretched across the park. The breeze became cooler. Families packed picnic baskets. Children waved goodbye to friends. The peaceful rhythm of the day continued. Watching the sunset, your soulmate remembered another conversation from years earlier. Someone had once said, "Most conflicts aren't caused by lack of love. They're caused by incomplete understanding." At the time those words sounded simple. Now they felt profound. How many disagreements begin with assumptions? How many relationships become strained because questions were never asked? How many opportunities for healing quietly wait behind one honest conversation? Those thoughts stayed with them. Because your heart needs this right now, because open communication creates space for trust to grow. And listen to this. As evening settled across the neighborhood, they returned home and opened the notebook one final time before bed. Instead of writing about regrets, they wrote about intentions. Tomorrow I will ask before assuming. Tomorrow I will listen before responding. Tomorrow I will choose curiosity instead of certainty. Tomorrow I will remember that every person has a story I cannot fully see. Those promises felt small. Yet they carried tremendous hope. Not because tomorrow promised perfection, but because tomorrow offered another opportunity to grow. Standing beside the window, they watched the first stars appear across the quiet sky. The title of this story had suggested a dramatic revelation. Instead, the truth was quieter, and perhaps more meaningful. The discovery wasn't that someone had secretly changed. The discovery was that assumptions had quietly hidden a deeper understanding all along. Before closing the notebook, they carefully wrote one final sentence. The greatest breakthroughs don't always happen when someone else changes. Sometimes they happen when we become willing to see with greater patience, humility, and compassion. They gently closed the notebook. Tomorrow remained unwritten. New conversations would come. New opportunities to listen would appear. New chances to replace assumptions with understanding would quietly arrive. And for the first time in a long while, they looked toward tomorrow not with certainty, but with hope. Because your heart needs this right now, because the strongest relationships are built not by people who never misunderstand each other, but by people who remain willing to listen, learn, forgive, and grow together. Don't skip. Listen carefully. Author's note: this is a fictional, inspirational story. It does not describe real events or claim that a real soulmate is secretly thinking about you. It is written to encourage empathy, honest communication, forgiveness, and personal growth. And listen to this. The morning after those quiet reflections felt different. Not because the world had changed overnight. Not because every unanswered question had suddenly disappeared. But because something inside your soulmate had begun to soften. For the first time in a long while, they admitted something to themselves that had been difficult to face. What if I didn't know the whole story? The question stayed with them as sunlight slowly filled the room. Outside, birds greeted another peaceful morning. A cool breeze drifted through the open window. Neighbors exchanged friendly smiles. Children laughed as they hurried toward school. Life continued as it always had. Yet their heart no longer looked at the world with complete certainty. Instead, it looked with curiosity. Because your heart needs this right now, because understanding often begins the moment certainty gives way to humility. And listen to this. After breakfast they decided not to distract themselves with endless tasks. Instead, they returned to the same quiet cafe where thoughtful conversations often seemed easier to have. The familiar aroma of fresh coffee filled the room. Soft music played quietly in the background. People spoke in gentle voices. Everything felt peaceful. Finding a seat near the window, they opened their notebook. Instead of writing answers, they wrote questions. What assumptions have I made? Which conversations ended before I truly listened? Where did fear become louder than compassion? The questions were uncomfortable. Yet they felt necessary. Because your heart needs this right now, because meaningful growth often begins with honest self-reflection. Your soulmate quietly closed the notebook. And listen to this. While waiting for their drink, they overheard two older friends talking nearby. One of them smiled and quietly said, "The biggest mistake I ever made wasn't trusting too much. It was deciding I already knew someone else's heart." Those words immediately captured their attention. The second friend nodded. Most misunderstandings aren't created by bad intentions. They're created by incomplete information. Your soulmate sat perfectly still. It felt as though those simple sentences had been spoken directly to them. Because your heart needs this right now, because assumptions often grow where honest conversations are missing. They finished their coffee slowly. Then stepped outside into the warm afternoon sunlight. And listen to this. Instead of rushing home, they wandered through familiar streets. Everything looked ordinary. A florist carefully arranged colorful flowers outside the shop. A baker greeted customers with genuine warmth. A child proudly showed a drawing to a smiling parent. Simple moments quietly unfolded everywhere. Watching these ordinary scenes reminded them that people carry unseen stories. Every smile hides a struggle. Every quiet face carries hopes. Every heart holds experiences invisible to everyone else. That realization made them pause. How often had they believed they understood someone after seeing only one small part of their story? Because your heart needs this right now, because compassion grows when we remember that every person is more complex than our first impression. Your soulmate reflected deeply. And listen to this. Eventually they arrived at the peaceful park where they often gathered their thoughts. The old oak tree stretched across the familiar wooden bench. The breeze gently moved through its branches. Children laughed nearby. Birds rested peacefully overhead. Sitting quietly, they remembered a conversation from years before. Someone had once misunderstood them completely. At the time, it had been painful. No matter how carefully they explained themselves, the other person had already decided what was true. Now they realized something surprising. Perhaps they had unknowingly done the same thing to others. That realization didn't fill them with shame. It filled them with humility. Because your heart needs this right now, because recognizing our own blind spots allows wisdom to grow. Your soulmate quietly smiled. And listen to this. As the afternoon continued, they noticed a grandfather teaching his granddaughter how to solve a puzzle. Whenever she placed a piece in the wrong spot, she looked frustrated. The grandfather never criticized her. Instead he gently said, "Turn it around. Sometimes we're looking at the right piece from the wrong angle." Those simple words stayed with your soulmate. How many relationships had suffered simply because people viewed the same situation from different perspectives? Perhaps understanding sometimes required changing the angle before changing the conclusion. Because your heart needs this right now, because empathy often begins by trying to see life through another person's eyes. Your soulmate treasured that lesson. And listen to this. The afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. Golden sunlight covered the park with warmth. Families gathered for picnics. Friends shared quiet conversations. An elderly couple walked hand in hand without saying very much. Watching them reminded your soulmate that trust isn't built by always being right. Trust grows when people feel safe enough to be honest. They realized they wanted to become someone who listened without immediately judging. Someone who asked gentle questions. Someone willing to admit, "I may have misunderstood." Those words suddenly felt like strength rather than weakness. Because your heart needs this right now, because humility strengthens relationships far more than pride ever can. Your soulmate quietly embraced that truth. And listen to this. Returning home, they opened the notebook once again. This time they didn't write about assumptions. They wrote about the kind of person they hope to become. Someone who listens before deciding. Someone who asks before concluding. Someone who protects trust through patience. Someone who values understanding more than being right. Reading those words brought a quiet sense of peace. Not because every misunderstanding had been solved, but because they finally knew the direction they wanted to follow. Growth had become more important than certainty. Compassion had become more valuable than assumptions. Because your heart needs this right now, because every day offers another opportunity to build healthier relationships through empathy and honesty. Your soulmate smiled softly. And listen to this. Night slowly settled across the neighborhood. Stars appeared one by one above the quiet streets. Standing beside the window, they reflected on the title of this story. At first, it sounded dramatic. But the real discovery wasn't about someone else changing. It was about discovering how easily assumptions can hide the truth, and how healing begins when we choose to listen with open hearts instead. Before closing the notebook, they carefully wrote one final paragraph. Today I learned that understanding is not something we accidentally discover. It is something we intentionally pursue through patience, humility, honest conversations, and genuine compassion. Tomorrow I will ask more questions, make fewer assumptions, and remember that every person carries a story I cannot fully see. They gently closed the notebook. The room became wonderfully quiet. Tomorrow remained unwritten. New conversations would come. New opportunities to understand would appear. New moments would invite patience instead of judgment. And for the first time in a long while, they felt hopeful. Not because life had suddenly become simple, but because they had discovered that every misunderstanding contains the possibility of deeper understanding when people choose empathy over assumption. Don't skip. Listen carefully. Author's note: this is a fictional, inspirational story. It does not describe real events or claim that a real soulmate is secretly thinking about you. It is written for entertainment and encouragement, emphasizing empathy, honest communication, forgiveness, and personal growth. And listen to this. The morning arrived with an unusual calm. The soft glow of sunrise stretched across the bedroom floor. A cool breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of fresh rain and blooming flowers. Birds greeted the new day with cheerful songs. The neighborhood slowly awakened. Children laughed on their way to school. Neighbors waved as they collected the morning newspaper. Everything appeared exactly as it had the day before. Yet something inside your soulmate had quietly transformed. The questions that once demanded immediate answers had become quieter. In their place grew something far more powerful. Humility. For the first time, they admitted that understanding another person's heart required more than assumptions. It required patience. It required listening. It required courage. Because your heart needs this right now, because the strongest relationships are built by people who remain willing to learn instead of insisting they already know everything. And listen to this. While preparing breakfast, they replayed countless conversations from the past. Not to criticize themselves. Not to dwell on regret. But to learn. They remembered moments when someone paused before answering. At the time, they assumed silence meant indifference. Now they wondered if that silence had actually been uncertainty, or exhaustion, or someone searching for the right words. They remembered messages that seemed brief. They once believed the short replies meant someone didn't care. Now they considered another possibility. Perhaps that person had simply been overwhelmed. Perhaps they had been carrying burdens invisible to everyone else. The realization was both humbling and comforting. Because your heart needs this right now, because compassion begins when we remember that every person is fighting battles we cannot always see. Your soulmate quietly nodded to themselves. And listen to this. Later that morning, they returned to the familiar park that had become a place of quiet reflection. The towering oak trees gently swayed in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dancing patterns across the walking path. Families gathered for morning picnics. Joggers smiled politely as they passed. A grandfather patiently taught his grandson how to fly a small kite. The kite struggled at first. It dipped. It tangled. It nearly fell to the ground. The child became discouraged. But the grandfather smiled warmly. "Don't give up," he said. "Sometimes the wind changes, and everything begins to work." Those simple words stayed with your soulmate. How many relationships had they nearly given up on simply because they assumed one difficult season would last forever? Because your heart needs this right now, because patience often reveals possibilities that frustration cannot see. They continued walking. And listen to this. A little farther along the path, they noticed a young artist sitting quietly beside the lake. The artist wasn't painting what was directly in front of them. Instead, they paused often, stepped back, adjusted their perspective, and then added another careful brushstroke. Watching this fascinated your soulmate. It reminded them that perspective changes everything. The same landscape can appear completely different depending on where we choose to stand. Could relationships be the same? Could two people experience the very same conversation in completely different ways? That thought opened a door inside their heart. Because your heart needs this right now, because empathy grows when we become curious about another person's perspective. Your soulmate smiled softly. And listen to this. They found the familiar wooden bench beneath the old oak tree and opened their notebook. For several moments, they simply stared at the blank page. Then they slowly began writing. Today I realized I have sometimes mistaken confusion for rejection. I have sometimes mistaken silence for lack of care. I have sometimes mistaken distance for indifference. The truth may have been far more complicated. Reading those words didn't fill them with guilt. Instead, it filled them with freedom. Because once we acknowledge that we don't know everything, we become open to learning something new. Because your heart needs this right now, because wisdom begins where pride ends. And listen to this. As the afternoon continued, they noticed an elderly woman feeding birds near the pond. A small child walked over and asked why the birds weren't afraid of her. The woman smiled gently. Because they learned that kindness doesn't always arrive loudly, she replied. Sometimes it arrives quietly, day after day, until trust grows. Those words lingered in your soulmate's heart. Trust wasn't something demanded. It was something patiently earned. Conversation after conversation. Choice after choice. Day after day. Because your heart needs this right now, because trust grows through consistency more than grand promises. Your soulmate quietly reflected. And listen to this. The afternoon slowly faded into evening. Golden sunlight shimmered across the surface of the lake. Gentle ripples spread outward before disappearing into stillness. Watching the water reminded them that misunderstandings are often like ripples. They seem enormous in the moment. But with patience, honesty, and understanding, they gradually settle. Not every disagreement has to become a permanent divide. Not every misunderstanding has to become the end of a relationship. Sometimes all that's needed is one sincere conversation. One honest question. One willingness to truly listen. Because your heart needs this right now, because healing often begins with a conversation both people have been afraid to start. Your soulmate took a deep breath. And listen to this. Returning home, they placed the notebook on the table beside the window. The evening sky slowly darkened. Stars appeared one by one across the horizon. Instead of reflecting on what they wished they had done differently, they focused on what they would do from this day forward. Across a fresh page they carefully wrote, "I will ask before assuming. I will listen before responding. I will seek understanding before forming conclusions. I will choose compassion even when I don't fully understand. I will remember that every heart carries a story I cannot completely see." Those weren't dramatic promises. They were quiet commitments. The kind that slowly change a person's character over time. Because your heart needs this right now, because lasting transformation is built through consistent daily choices rather than one extraordinary moment. Your soulmate smiled peacefully. And listen to this. Standing beside the window before bed, they reflected on everything they had learned. The title of this story suggested that discovering the truth would leave someone falling apart. But the deeper truth was different. They weren't falling apart. Their assumptions were. And once those assumptions faded, something much healthier could finally grow. understanding, patience, empathy, humility. Those qualities became the foundation for a new beginning. Before closing the notebook for the night, they wrote one final paragraph. Today I learned that being wrong is not the end of the story. Refusing to learn would have been. Every misunderstanding carries the possibility of greater wisdom if we choose humility over pride, curiosity over certainty, and compassion over judgment. From this day forward, I want every conversation to begin with listening and end with kindness. They gently closed the notebook. The room became wonderfully still. Tomorrow remained unwritten. New conversations would come. New opportunities to understand would appear. New moments would invite patience instead of assumptions. And for the first time in a long while, they felt a quiet sense of hope. Not because every question had been answered, but because they had finally discovered that the strongest relationships are not built by people who never misunderstand one another. They are built by people who remain willing to listen, learn, forgive, and grow together. Don't skip. Listen carefully. Author's note: this is a fictional, inspirational story. It does not describe real events or claim that a real soulmate is secretly thinking about you. It is meant to encourage empathy, honest communication, forgiveness, and personal growth. And listen to this. The final morning arrived more quietly than any other. The sun slowly rose above the horizon, filling the room with warm golden light. A cool breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of fresh flowers after an early rain. Birds welcomed the day with cheerful songs. The neighborhood slowly came alive. Children laughed on their way to school. A neighbor waved while watering flowers. Someone walked a dog along the sidewalk. Everything looked ordinary. Yet inside your soulmate's heart, everything had changed. Only a few days earlier, they had believed they understood the entire story. Now they realized they had only seen a small part of it. That realization didn't leave them feeling defeated. It left them feeling humble. Because your heart needs this right now, because wisdom often begins when certainty gives way to understanding. And listen to this. They prepared a simple breakfast and carried a warm cup of tea to the window. Instead of rushing into another busy day, they sat quietly. No phone. No distractions. Only silence. For the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves to think honestly. They replayed old conversations. Not to criticize themselves. Not to dwell on regret. But to learn. They remembered moments when they interrupted instead of listening. Moments when they assumed they knew another person's intentions. Moments when fear spoke louder than compassion. Each memory taught the same lesson. Understanding requires patience. Because your heart needs this right now, because meaningful relationships grow when people seek understanding instead of quick conclusions. Your soulmate quietly smiled. And listen to this. Later that morning they returned one final time to the familiar park that had quietly become their place of reflection. The old oak tree stood peacefully beneath the bright blue sky. Its branches swayed gently in the breeze. Children laughed while chasing one another across the grass. Friends shared coffee on nearby benches. An elderly couple slowly walked hand in hand without saying much at all. Watching them reminded your soulmate of something simple. The strongest relationships rarely depend on dramatic moments. They are strengthened through thousands of ordinary choices. Choosing patience. Choosing honesty. Choosing forgiveness. Choosing kindness. Again and again. Because your heart needs this right now, because lasting trust is built one ordinary day at a time. They sat beneath the oak tree once more. And listen to this. Nearby, a young boy accidentally dropped his lunch. Before he could react, several strangers quietly helped gather everything together. Nobody argued about whose responsibility it was. Nobody asked for recognition. They simply helped. Watching those strangers reminded your soulmate that compassion often appears when people stop asking, "Who's right?" and begin asking, "How can I help?" That small moment stayed with them. Because your heart needs this right now, because kindness often heals what arguments never can. Your soulmate reflected deeply. And listen to this. As the afternoon sunlight warmed the walking path, they opened the notebook one final time. Every page told the story of a changing heart. The first pages were filled with certainty. The middle pages were filled with questions. The final pages were filled with humility. Looking through those pages, they realized they hadn't simply learned about someone else. They had learned about themselves. They had discovered that assumptions often speak loudly. Understanding speaks quietly. But understanding lasts longer. Because your heart needs this right now, because self-awareness is one of the greatest gifts we can develop. Your soulmate slowly turned to the final blank page. They paused. Took a deep breath. Then began writing. I cannot change yesterday. But I can choose how I respond today. I can ask questions before making assumptions. I can listen before reacting. I can offer grace instead of judgment. I can protect relationships through honesty and patience. Every sentence felt like a promise. Not to another person, but to themselves. Because lasting change begins within. Because your heart needs this right now, because healthy relationships are built by people who continue growing throughout life. And listen to this. The afternoon slowly became evening. Golden sunlight reflected across the peaceful lake. Gentle ripples moved across the water before disappearing into stillness. Watching the lake reminded your soulmate of the human heart. Misunderstandings create ripples. Harsh words create ripples. Assumptions create ripples. Yet compassion has the power to calm them. Not instantly, but faithfully. One conversation. One apology. One act of patience at a time. That realization brought them unexpected peace. Because your heart needs this right now, because healing usually begins with one sincere step toward understanding. Your soulmate quietly smiled. And listen to this. As the sun slowly disappeared below the horizon, they stood beside the lake watching the sky fill with shades of gold, orange, pink, and violet. They thought back to the dramatic title of this story. Your soulmate just found out they were wrong about you, and they're falling apart. Now they understood the deeper meaning. What truly fell apart wasn't another person. It was pride. It was certainty without understanding. It was the habit of assuming instead of listening. And what replaced it was far stronger. Humility. Empathy. Patience. Compassion. Hope. Because your heart needs this right now, because letting go of unhealthy assumptions makes room for healthier relationships. And listen to this. Returning home that evening, they placed the notebook on the table for the final time. The room felt peaceful. Stars slowly appeared outside the window. The world became wonderfully quiet. Before closing the notebook forever, they carefully wrote one final message across the last page. If I learned anything from this journey, it is this. Never believe you know someone's whole story after seeing only one chapter. Never let assumptions become stronger than conversations. Never allow pride to silence an honest question. Choose patience before judgment. Choose understanding before certainty. Choose kindness before criticism. And remember that every person you meet is carrying experiences you may never fully understand. They gently closed the notebook. The journey had come to an end. But something beautiful had begun. Tomorrow would bring new people. New conversations. New opportunities to listen. New opportunities to forgive. New opportunities to grow. And this time, they would meet those opportunities differently. Not with fear. Not with assumptions. But with open hearts. Because your heart needs this right now, because the strongest relationships are built by people who choose empathy, honesty, humility, and compassion every single day. They smiled one final time before turning off the light. The room became still. The stars continued shining outside. And they rested peacefully, knowing that the greatest transformation had never been discovering they were wrong. It was becoming the kind of person who was willing to admit it, learn from it, and love more wisely because of it.